Hey everybody! Today we're going to continue Nature of Science with Lesson 2, the scientific method. We made a couple of changes from before. This PowerPoint is color-coded, which means that in your notes you should have anything that's in orange, and your vocab words are going to be in pink. Our learning objectives for today: after today you should be able to describe and explain what characterizes science and its methods. You should be able to describe how scientific inferences are drawn from observations. You should be able to recognize the role of creativity in constructing your scientific questions, methods, and explanations. The word chemistry comes from the word alchemy. Alchemists were prevalent in medieval times. They wanted to change metals like lead into gold. Alchemists were responsible for developing the tools and techniques for working with chemicals. They actually designed a lot of equipment that's still used today, like beakers, flasks, tongs, funnels, and the mortar and pestle. The scientific method is defined as a logical, systematic approach to the solution of a scientific problem. Usually, it's taught as a list of steps that scientists must follow to conduct an experiment. In reality, the scientific method isn't performed as steps, but it's a cycle of good scientific practice. The most important parts of the scientific method are making observations, posing questions, making inferences, proposing and testing your hypothesis, analyzing your data, developing your theory or your law, and then communicating the results of your experiment. We're going to talk about these pieces in detail. An observation is when you use your senses to obtain information. This scientist is making an observation using her microscope. Observations are essential in the scientific method. An inference is when you're coming up with a conclusion based on an observation. So we can infer that it's raining based on the observation that these students are wearing rain gear. Can you think of some other observations that you can make about this picture? What about some inferences? An observation would be that this student is wearing a green rain jacket. You could infer that because his rain jacket is green is his favorite color. An observation, remember, is something that you can see with your five senses, or something that you can experience with your five senses. An inference is the conclusion based on that observation. We can observe that there are planets and stars on the door, so we could infer that this class is learning about the solar system. Let's do a critical thinking scenario. If you try to turn on a flashlight and it doesn't light, what are some observations that you're making? What are some inferences? You can observe that the light bulb isn't turning on. You can observe that the switch works or doesn't work. Based on your observations, come up with a hypothesis. Why isn't the flashlight working? Then design an experiment that you can do to actually test your hypothesis. Let's say you guess that the batteries in the flashlight are dead. That's your hypothesis. A hypothesis is a proposed explanation for an observation. The observation is that your flashlight's not working. Your explanation is that the batteries must be dead. In order for something to be a hypothesis rather than an inference, it must be testable. So what would you do next? If your hypothesis is that the batteries are dead, replacing the batteries is technically an experiment that you can do to test your hypothesis. An experiment is a procedure that's used to test the hypothesis. Any experiment has to have constants and variables. Your independent variable is the thing that you change during an experiment. The dependent variable is the thing that is observed for a change during the experiment. and your constant is any part of the experiment that remains unchanged. In our flashlight example, the independent variable would be the changing batteries. The dependent variable would be the light, whether or not the light turns on at the end of the experiment or at the end of the change. The constant could be the light bulb or the flashlight itself. For the results of an experiment to be accepted, the experiment must produce the same result no matter how many times it's repeated or by whom. This is why scientists are expected to publish a description of their procedures along with their results. So when a scientist writes a paper, they have to tell the reader exactly what they did. That way, anyone that wants to could duplicate their results. Communication is the last and possibly most important step. Scientific journals are always the most reliable source of information about new discoveries. Articles are published only after undergoing something called peer review. Peer review is an intense evaluation of scientific, academic, and professional work by experts in the same field. That means if you've done an experiment and you want to publish those results, you have to have your research criticized by experts. Your reviewers might find errors in your experimental design, and they often challenge your conclusions. So you have to be really sure of your research before you try to publish your information. The review process is good. Undergoing review means that work that's lazy, not well-founded, can't be repeated, is not published. Scientific journals are usually ranked by something called impact factor, which tells us how often select articles inside are cited each year. So Nature Medicine has an impact factor of 36.13. That means that a lot of people are citing, reading, and using the research that's published in Nature Medicine. This makes sense because medicine is a huge field, so it's going to be cited most often. ACS Chemical Biology has a lower impact factor of 4.37 because the articles that are published here are very specific and really only used by chemical biologists. Impact factor is often mistaken for a good journal versus a bad journal, but that's not necessarily true. Fun fact, ACS Chemical Biology, this picture is from a publication that I actually worked on when I did research. So I'm pretty proud of this one. That's all for today. Go ahead and move on to the assignment for scientific method.